Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for coming to the Unhustle podcast and sharing your thoughts about work and rest with the Unhustle community. I'm super excited to have you.
Oh, thank you, Melina. It's great to be with you.
All right. So, where should we kick it off? Why don't we start? It is Monday. So, we'll get to the deep play in a little bit. But why don't we start? Why don't we start with it? Why don't we start talking about the deep play? Why is it important? What is it? Let's start there, and then we'll get into the work part.
Sure. And the concept of deep play is something that I talk about in my book, Rest, which is about kind of the secret role that rest plays in the lives of really creative and prolific people. People like Nobel Prize winners or famous composers or writers. And the term deep play actually comes from anthropologist Clifford Geertz and a famous essay of his about Balinese cockfighting and the incredibly rich symbolic meaning that you can read out of what seems like this, really terrible blood sport. But for me, deep play is a way of sort of understanding the value of challenging, often time-consuming, sometimes dangerous hobbies in the lives of people who seem to not have a whole lot of time for these sorts of things, right? I'm talking about, activities like mountain climbing pursued by, scientists who are locked in a race to find the next great discovery, or CEOs who are running companies, who will regularly take time out, weeks at a time, and go on these long trips or go sailing or do other really challenging, time-consuming things. It seems counterintuitive, especially these days, right? When we have this vision of success that is very much wedded to long hours at work, in which we are expressing our passion for what we do by, never leaving the office, sleeping under our desks, and, living on ramen noodles and Benzedrine. What it turns out, though, is that these kinds of these kinds of hobbies turn out to be super valuable as both a source of creative renewal and as actually a source of creative discovery. I think it turns out something like a fifth, 20% of tech startups have their origins in ideas that founders have while they're on vacation or while they're on a break between one company and another. There are lots of famous examples of people who start big projects after having some epiphany while on vacation. My favorite is Lin-Manuel Miranda, who had worked on his first musical, In the Heights, and had performed it for 7 years, was finally convinced by his spouse to take a break. He went on vacation with her and took a copy of Ron Chernow's biography with him. And he says that as soon as he got a break from In the Heights, Hamilton jumped into his head. And so one of the most successful musical productions of the last 50 years gets its start during a vacation. But these kinds of breaks also serve as an opportunity for people to engage as well, just in a kind of deep recharge of the physical and mental batteries and energy that they spend working hard. And they also turn out to choose activities that have an interesting kind of envelope of properties. They're often mentally or physically challenging, and it turns out that these actually make them more restorative and more restful than just like sitting on a couch with a remote in one hand and a bag of salty snacks in the other. It's also the case that that people who choose really well often choose hobbies that offer some of the same kinds of rewards that they find in work at its very best, but in a very different kind of context or different medium, and often a different kind of time scale. One of my favorite examples is Winston Churchill, who wrote a short book about painting as a pastime, in which he extolled the virtues of painting for politicians and writers and journalists. And he said that, for him, what was great about painting was that, first of all, there's an active dimension to it. It's really difficult to get busy people to slow down and to just do nothing, right? What you need, if you're that kind of person, is not to try to stop doing everything, but rather to have something else that competes with your day job. He also recommended painting because for him, it was like politics. Not the first thing you would, the first association you would make, but as he explained, it was like politics in that in both cases, you needed a clear vision of what you wanted to do. In one case, more literal than the other. You needed to think about how you're going to go about executing. You needed to be strategic. You had a limited amount of time which to act before the paint dries. But when he was painting, he said, you didn't have the Labor Party standing over your shoulder trying to erase everything you were doing as fast as you worked, right? So it was the stuff that was the most fun, the most rewarding about politics without the frustrations. And likewise, when you talk to, let's say, scientists who mountain climb, they talk about climbing as being a lot like science because it is a kind of intense engagement with nature, very different from what they experience in the laboratory, though, but still. It's also an enterprise where you have to take a really big problem, you break it down to a whole bunch of separate components, and then you execute, right? It's also something that requires intense concentration. When you're 500 feet up, the sheer face of a mountain, you do not want to lose focus any more than you do when you're working on a hard scientific problem. But it's different in the sense that when you're doing science, you can spend years working on doing an experiment and interpreting results, and the answer might be, well, maybe. Whereas with climbing, you either reach the top at the end of the day or you don't, right? The rewards are very, very clear and they come pretty quickly. And so deep play is something that turns out to offer opportunities for both escape from work, opportunities for reminding ourselves of what it is in our work that we love best when it goes really well, and opportunities for a kind of creative renewal and sometimes even creative discovery. And so that's why it turns out that, people who are incredibly ambitious, who love what they do, who spend their entire lives getting better at it, will, drop everything for a month at a time in order to go climb Mont Blanc or, go sailing in the South Pacific or go painting in the south of France.
Do you see me nodding in agreement the whole time?
I certainly do, yes.
So let me tell you a story. And you might have seen that on my website, I don't know. But let me tell you what happened to me, because what you're describing is I actually lived it. I still live it, but it was a drastic change for me when I realized that happening. And what I did is, I told you we started to go to Baja and spend the winters there. But the very first time we went there, it turned out to be a digital detox trip for me because there was no internet, so I couldn't connect. So whether I liked it or didn't like it, I didn't have a choice to connect. And that gave me a lot of time to enjoy my vacation. And in that time, we decided to learn how to kiteboard, which is, kiteboarding.
Yeah, sure.
You fly a kite and you have a board, and
right.
And it's for me, it's a very concentrated effort, because things could happen really, really quickly. And bad things can happen really, really quickly. So you need to have 100% of your attention on what's going on and be able to act. For me, Alex, it turned out to be a very mindful, I was completely in a state of flow, very mindful activity where, time just stopped. And at that time, I realized that, wait a minute, what I'm doing with my life is probably not 100% what I need to be doing. I think I need to pivot a little bit and to find more meaning and more fulfillment. And this is how Unhustle was born. And ever since then, because before that I did digital marketing, and it was great. I loved it, but it wasn't 100%. And so what you're describing, I've experienced it 100%, and I continue to look for this now that I know it, and I know the science and the studies behind it, like you're saying. Now I know that going for a mountain bike for an hour in the middle of the day is beneficial to my work. And I try to, I'm just like every other entrepreneur, million things to do, never ending. But mentally, I'm more aware right now that it's actually so beneficial to do that, because your brain doesn't stop thinking, right? You're still thinking, but it gives you just that little bit of, what's the right word for this? I mean, it's even more, it's a creative outlet, but it's inspirational, but it's just that deep rest period that your brain needs so much. So I guess my question with all of this is, why are we not using more of this in our days? Why do we get so sucked into the gotta do, check my emails, finish this project, that project, which is never ending? We know we're never gonna catch up, because if we were gonna catch up, we would have been caught up by now. Why are we doing it, and what can we do about it?
Right. Okay. So why we're doing it, I think. So one part of the answer is that we assume that accomplishment, success, doing stuff requires, conscious effort and work, right? That sort of one of the things that I realized when I started working on my previous book, Rest, was that, we often, when you write, let's say, a biography of a famous person, it's often called like Life and Work, whoever. And what that does unconsciously is focus our attention on those periods when that person is actually working, on those hours or years of labor. And it directs our attention away from asking, what was the value of those long weekends, or those, month-long hikes, or those vacations, that, what role did those things play in that person's life? There's a wonderful biography of William Gladstone, the great 19th century British politician, that for me really sort of brought this home, because it's a beautifully written piece. I learned an immense amount about Gladstone and Victorian politics from it. But I realized that, it is structured in a way that, in which the author will spend pages and pages and pages talking about a week of, parliamentary maneuvers and debates and so on. And then it ends, and Gladstone will go hiking in Italy for a month. And that's dealt with in a paragraph. You can almost sense the author's impatience, the desire to get back to where the action is. And I think that reflects a deeper assumption that, that we can only understand a person's achievement or creative breakthroughs by focusing on those times when they are trying to work. That turns out, I think, though, and that turns out not quite to be the case. That, we need to pay attention to how people rest, to the role that hobbies play in their creative lives. And fortunately, there's been enough work in neuroscience and the psychology of creativity to understand the ways in which work and play, work and rest build on and support each other. So I think that thinking of rest as purely unproductive time is one problem. Another is that we have a vision of success now that does not involve a life in which you start at the bottom, in the mailroom, you work your way up the ladder, and finally, later in life, you reach the pinnacle of your profession. As it was, let's say, in the 1950s, when both General Electric and General Motors, the two biggest companies in the United States, were both run by guys named Charlie Wilson, both of whom had started in the mailrooms of their respective companies and over 30 or 40 years finally risen to the top. The way you become successful now is, you drop out of Harvard, and then you work titanically hard for 5 years, and then you become a multi-billionaire. And if that doesn't happen by the time you're 30, it's never going to happen. So success is a race against time and against essentially your own age and obsolescence. And I think, and then, another reason is that we have very few examples of people who become successful in any other kind of way. Whether they actually sort of perform, whether they actually become successful through monumental effort or not, that's the story that we're told about them. And so I think, and then, pretty much all of our friends are doing it, and we don't want to get left out, and we don't want to let them down. So it becomes very easy to absorb that ourselves. For all of those reasons, overwork comes to seem natural and inevitable and inescapable. It almost becomes a sort of moral imperative. It's a measure of how committed we are to our work. It is a promise of sort of future success, and it's a way of understanding and performing our seriousness. But the downside is that it actually is counterproductive and is more likely to lead us to burnout, to have sort of inferior rather than superior ideas, and to do what we love for, a shorter period of our lives than we would otherwise. So that's where it comes from. A long answer, but but in order to understand why it's so difficult to escape this, to see it to see it differently, it's important to answer at length. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's very insightful and well done. So then here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and you've written a very good case for the 4-day work week. Do you believe that this pandemic we're in could have a silver lining in the way we take a look at how we work, whether that's working from home or a corporation working? I mean, you present some excellent cases and show some examples of companies that have gone that route, and there's no looking back. So would you like to share a few cases from your book on that?
Yeah, and I am hopeful that we will be able to build on our collective experiences of the last few months, which also come at the end of years of conversation about the flaws and limits of globalization, about growing income inequality, about the causes and consequences of overwork and burnout, discussion about the enduring problems that we have with work-life balance, with the growing instability of careers and precariousness of labor, all of which tell us that the way that we have been working really doesn't work any longer, and we need to find something else. One of the things that the pandemic has done is open the door to doing things differently. It has shown in remarkably short order that things like flexible work and work from home, which many a manager declared were the hills that they would die on and they could never allow in their organizations, turn out to be possible, can be implemented by people very quickly under remarkably stressful conditions, right? We've had people who have become virtual remote workers while also being full-time caregivers, while, having to become school teachers, learn, their own bakers, or of emergency response people, et cetera, et cetera. if you can do it under those circumstances, there is no reason to think that you need to go back to the way things were before. I think that the question that we'll face is how much of these, how basically is how we build upon sort of these insights and how we take advantage of these opportunities. I think if we run into serious economic challenges, it's always harder during a recession to implement those kinds of positive changes. On the other hand, I think that given that it was already clear that we had to make changes, discovering that it's possible to make substantive structural changes in how work operates, I think is a cause for optimism. I do think that, more specifically, the cat is out of the bag when it comes to remote and flexible work. That certainly for any kind of professional and knowledge work, it is going to be up to companies to explain why they cannot continue these practices, which have proven to be successes during the pandemic. I also think that when I am seeing companies that had moved to 4-day weeks before the pandemic talking to me about how the experience of figuring out how to implement a 4-day week turned out to give them a whole bunch of skills that proved really useful during the pandemic. That, the work of learning how to use their time better, how to collaborate better, how to use technology more effectively to solve the problem of doing 5 days worth of work in 4, really let them pivot very quickly to figuring out how to do all of this work remotely. It was a very similar set of challenges, and often they already had at hand the same tools that they would use to solve this new problem. But the idea of reinventing work this was just like, we've been through this, we know how to do it. Likewise, I've seen companies that have successfully managed the transition during the pandemic from everybody working in an office to everybody working remotely, realizing, what? We can use and build on this experience to move now to a 4-day week. And I've seen several companies actually making that move in the last few weeks, announcing that either they were going to do trials or that they were going to permanently implement a shorter workday. I think also that, all of these cases tell us that moving to a 4-day week can allow organizations to become more flexible and resilient and creative, which is always a good thing. But also, and then finally, when combined with things like a certain amount of working from home, that a 4-day week can allow companies to kind of spread out the amount of time that people are spending in, sort of in offices or in stores, places which we know can be COVID or flu hotspots, and thereby making them safer places, making them places that customers are more likely to return to, and places to which employees can return with a higher degree of confidence. So for all of those reasons, I think that these are trends that we're going to see continue, and we're going to see people and companies continue to build upon.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think this presented an opportunity for many companies to realize that here we are working from home, everything's fine, things are moving along. I did speak with somebody who you're also using your book as an example, Stefan Arstow.
Mm-hmm.
I just had a conversation with him. We haven't made that podcast live yet, but he did share his experience. He did go to a 5-hour work day, so he has a different setup with his company. But Stefan is the founder of Tower Paddleboards, right? And he implemented this quite a few years back, I want to say. I don't remember exactly when, maybe 2017. Now, the interesting part is, right. I think the interesting part with him, though, is that when he implemented it, everything went really well, and they figured out how to work a shorter day. However, he just shared with me that the work culture changed after a few years, and he's actually bringing back an 8-hour day during the off season. So he's still staying on a 5-day work week during his busy season at the moment. But then in the winter time, he's giving his people want to actually work a normal day, which I found quite interesting. So obviously, I want to look at all sides of the argument here. Have you had an experience with any companies that have tried the 4-day work week and then have gone back to a 5-day?
There are a small number who have done that. Tower paddleboards. The other reason that that Tower paddleboards expanded its hours was that Amazon got into the mail order paddleboard business, and Tower's revenues dropped by 80% or so over the course of about 12 months. So they faced a gigantic business model and revenue challenge. I think Stefan also talks about the impact on kind of work culture, but I think that that there were other factors at play sort of as well. Another example is Treehouse, which is a company, an educational software or online service company in Portland that implemented a 4-day week and then moved away from it. I think mainly again under economic pressures. The cases that I know of that I talk about in the book also include ones where the company went through a reorganization, and so when they became this new company, it became more difficult to sustain a 4-day week for whatever reasons, and also because of other cultural issues. So there was a video production company in Hong Kong, for example, that allowed everyone to choose 1 day off out of the 5, and production continued. They were as profitable as they were before, but the feeling was that with people out shooting on location, with client meetings, etc., the office turned into kind of a ghost town, and there was never a time when there was a critical mass of people in the office, and people turned out to miss that. And so after about 4 months or so, the CEO said, "You know what? We're gonna pull back on this." So I think that there certainly are cases where a shorter work week ceases to be viable or defensible for one reason or another. But I think it's also the case that that especially in the case of the impact on office culture or social life, we see plenty of examples of companies that have successfully managed the jump from a 5-day week to a 4, and have changed or implemented new things that have allowed people to or have continued to have a sense of camaraderie and sociability, even in days that are sort of more focused and where people often are working harder. So, I think there are genuine issues, but there also are genuine solutions.
It sounds like for every 10 company, maybe 1 or 2 go back, but the majority of them stay for various reasons.
Yes, I think that once you go down this road, and if you're able to figure out how to make it work, you do the organizational and cultural changes necessary to put this into practice. I think it does become rather difficult to go back to people and to say, you know what, we want to have all of you work more hours after all. That turns out to be a really tough sell if your people can point to sales figures or productivity and such to show that this actually was working.
Yeah, one thing I've been getting more and more into is being able to work into a state of flow, because to me, from a working from home entrepreneur or anyone working from home, really, I mean, there's all these data and science that shows that in reality we're productive for 3 hours a day. So I'm really determined to get into that mode and get my work done. And then you still have the rest of the day to play or to do the non-essential things like responding to emails and all that stuff. What is your experience with that? Does that play into the 4-day work week?
Absolutely. Indeed, this is something that I saw repeatedly in both Rest and in Shorter. So at the company level, what I see often are companies setting aside particular times of day in which people can work undistracted on their most important projects. Essentially, it's time to get into flow states. So this will be a couple hours where it's perfectly okay to not answer the phone, to ignore email and Slack, to be a little bit antisocial. The expectation is that you will not you won't go to people with that one quick question that turns into a 10-minute conversation. And likewise, you can ignore someone who has a question like this unless it's unless it's a true, genuine emergency. And what people report is that you're able to get done in those couple really serious hours as much as you would get done in a semi-distracted day that's broken up by meetings and email and all the other things that we know eat into our productive time. Among creative individuals, you see a very similar thing where one of the most important things that they will do is learn to be super productive of their most productive hours. So often this will mean starting work very, very early in the morning, or whether you're someone like, Ernest Hemingway, who no matter how late he was up the night before drinking, was up by 6 o'clock at his desk writing, and he would put in a solid 4 hours. And by about 10 or 11 o'clock, he was pretty much done for the day. But this is a pattern that I see repeated constantly, right? People identifying what periods of the day they are most productive and most effective, taking that time and basically building walls around it so that they can work in that period completely undisturbed, and which allows them to be far more effective than they would, and indeed often more effective than they had been previously when they were trying to get work done by putting in really long hours or working continuously for 12 or 16-hour days. So that, I think that is it is an essential strategy both for individuals and for companies. It's one that is whose value is borne out by a wealth of research from everyone from productivity experts to organizational behavior people to psychologists. So there is anyone who's skeptical of it can look at hundreds of articles that explain and quantify its benefits. And it is, I think, an important wedge to drive into the idea that you become successful by working really long hours. No, success, particularly in knowledge-intensive and creative enterprises, is defined not by length of time, but by depth of flow. And I think that, and we see this repeatedly in the lives of super successful people, and more recently in companies that move from working long hours to working 4-day weeks.
Awesome. So besides the deep play and state of flow, what other strategies can you offer to somebody who is interested in this concept of work less and get more done?
So broadly speaking, what individuals do and what companies do are the same sets of things. And I think one of them is, as I said, not just setting aside time for flow, but figuring out when your most productive hours actually are is a really important practice.
How do you do that?
Well, you experiment, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, what I discovered somewhat to my chagrin, was, after a lifetime of, starting homework at 10 p.m. Or doing a lot of writing late at night. When I was writing my second book, I discovered that actually, now that I had kids and a job, it wasn't really viable to stay up until 1 or 2 o'clock to write. And so I flipped my schedule and started getting up super early. It took a couple of weeks to get into the habit and to actually successfully drag myself out of bed. But what I discovered was that even though I am not a night person, or not a morning person, I should say, that there is a quality to the super early morning that allows me to get both an amount of writing done and a quality of work and thinking done that is almost impossible at any other time of day. It really took about a month or so for me to get, to figure out that, getting up at 6 was good. Getting up at 5 was really terrific in terms of, in terms of output, and that the pain actually was going to be worth it. So I think that, even if you think of yourself as a night owl, or, as not a morning person, or maybe you're not an evening person, playing around with schedules in that way can be valuable for helping you figure out when your your peak productive period is going to be. I think another thing is actually, developing and maintaining the deep play or the hobbies that are going to occupy you when, in your off time. I think that on the everyday basis, unless you happen to live right beside a mountain, probably, something as sophisticated as climbing is not going to be what you do. But, we all have things that we enjoy. And I think that, taking them seriously and recognizing that spending time on them is not merely a waste of time, but rather has these creative benefits, is worthwhile. I think, again, it's worth spending some time on them because it takes a little while for your mind to reach the stage where it will reliably use those periods to continue working on problems, even in the absence of your creative attention. I have a couple dogs, and we go out walking every morning. I will write for a couple hours, then we go out, we go around the neighborhood, and I carry with me a notebook and, a pen, because and what I will do before I leave is write down one question that I've been working on that I haven't been able to solve. And I don't really try to work on it while I'm on the walk, but the very fact that I've written it down kind of primes my subconscious, so that as often as not, while I'm out with the dogs, looking at the trees and, enjoying the morning air and a little bit of sun, the answer will pop into my head.
You just described the unhustle morning. It's perfect.
Exactly. No, and it's something that, again, it takes practice, but it can, but, in fact, it is something that you can learn to do. I think another thing is that prioritizing, depth of flow over length of time is something that feels counterintuitive, or sometimes feels almost immoral these days. But in fact, time and time again has proved to be super valuable. I think another thing is that actually, resting when when your brain gets tired, rather than trying to push through, that turns out again to be one of those things that you think you don't need to do, but actually is really useful.
We feel guilty, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, but, I really could use a nap, but no, I should just push through it.
No, but but if you actually do stop and you take a nap for 20 minutes, you'll be far more effective the next several hours than if you just try and grind along.
Right.
When you're talking about knowledge work, you really are talking about trying to maximize moments of peak performance. That really is the entire game, and everything else you do in order to make those peaks just a little bit higher.
Right, right.
With organizations, I think that the other, what they find is that in addition to carving out peak times for people, you want to reduce the amount of this, organizational and personal distraction. So there are these fascinating studies that tell us that the average knowledge worker loses between 2 to 4 hours of productive time per day in ineffective meetings, in multitasking, in tech-driven distraction, etc. So if you can put a lid on those things, you go a long way to making the day a lot more productive and making it possible to do the same work in a lot less time. So I see companies moving meetings, let's say, from an hour as a default, which, someone in Microsoft decided 30 years ago with the calendar program that meetings would be an hour by default, to 15 minutes. You have agendas beforehand, you have a little bit of discipline around meetings, and all of a sudden you're able to free up gigantic amounts of time in people's schedules. It also involves learning how to use technologies in ways that help people be more focused and mindful rather than continuously partially distracted, as Linda Stone put it. So this means doing things like allowing people to check mail during particular times of day, right? Mornings and afternoons. It also means maybe putting limits on what you expect people to do in terms of responding to Slack channels, to voicemails, etc., so that people are no longer in a constant reactive mode with their technologies. Thinking also about how you can use technologies to automate less cognitively intensive or of creative tasks so that people have more time to focus on the stuff that really matters is another really important strategy. And whether you are in accounting or in design or any other field, thinking about how you can use your existing tools that way is a super valuable practice. And then I think that at a slightly more abstract level, simply recognizing the value of rest in helping make you more creative and in helping you live a longer, more sustainable creative life is kind of fundamental. We often think of rest as something that stands in opposition to work, or we think of leisure as something that is kind of that is a competitor to our working lives, and that's wrong. Work and rest are partners, not competitors. And the challenge for all of us is to design ways in which they can support and sustain each other. Because when you're able to do that, you have not only, you do better work, but you are on the route to having a longer, more sustainable life as well.
Thank you so much. Excellent strategies. I was going to tell you about, actually, I have it here. Have you heard of the book, The Power of When, with regards to chronotypes?
Right, yes.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because just like you, I used to think that I'm an evening person and get all my creative work done in the evening. And then I switched that to a morning, and I feel like it's more beneficial to me. I happen to be a bear based on the chronotypes, which I think about 50% of the population is, which is kind of your standard, 10 to 6. You sleep 10 to 6
right.
in the evening, and then you kind of have your time periods. But for those people who are not familiar, I'll put a link to that book as well in the show notes, because it's a good way to identify your peak performance, like Alex was talking about, with regards to when you're most creative, when you're most awake, when you most, most prime for exercise or for meetings or for interviews or writing or whatever it is. So I found it an interesting book I don't think I did too much from it, but it was helpful. Alex, if you can wave your magic wand, where would you like the world to be in about a year from now?
I would like to see what I would love to see is the 4-day week becoming more of a standard in more industries. What I would really love is to see, let's say, one country or sort of big province or city decide that, you know what, we're gonna do a reset. We're gonna take this opportunity and put schools, government, we're going to create incentives for companies to adopt a 4-day week, and we're going to see what happens. Because, one of the great objections to the 4-day week is, well, I would like to do it, but my clients expect me to be available 5 days a week, or we can't shift around government offices because the expectation is that we've got to be available, during regular business hours. And so I think making a shift like that across all of these different sectors would go a long way to eliminating some of the structural impediments to a shorter work week, and also allowing us to see some of the benefits across these various sectors. There are not a lot that governments have yet done, either or formally or informally, to shorten working hours, at least in the US and UK and other places where the 4-day week is starting to take hold. And I think it is high time to start seeing how we can design, whether they are policy incentives, financial incentives, or other things, to start to move, to give companies kind of space to experiment and to begin to remove some of the obstacles that they might feel are preventing them from doing so. I think and actually I'm fairly confident that we'll see this in a couple regions, probably in somewhat or surprising places like Korea or Japan, not just in Scandinavia, but that I think this is fairly likely to happen, let's say, in the next 12 months or so. And I think that'll be a really great thing.
You think Korea or Japan? Interesting. I was going to say Finland or New Zealand.
Right. But, New Zealand is also a possibility, but, Korea and Japan are really interesting because they are places that are seeing a lot of experimentation with the 4-day week, I think because they've had such big problems with overwork. Right? Japanese and Korean are the two languages in the world that have invented their own words for working yourself to death. And so if there are places that need this more than any others, it's there. I think that, the Nordic countries certainly have a long history of cooperation between companies and governments, and high degrees of social trust and social capital. So, I think once they do that, you might see it happening at a pretty big scale. And certainly there have been other experiments in the Nordic countries in shorter working hours, both in the business context and in government. But I think actually that I'm betting I'm going to see the first announced experiment like this on one or another side of the Sea of Japan.
Interesting. Microsoft just did an experiment in Japan, right?
That's correct.
The 4-hour work week.
Yeah, it was a 1-month experiment during August, and what they found was that that their productivity went up substantially. Their energy usage also dropped by I think 20%, because you didn't need to have the lights on one more day. And also paper usage dropped pretty substantially, a statistic that they added in mainly because it's a little bit of advertising for their own groupware product. But it was another indication of how there are these indirect benefits in terms of energy and environmental savings that can come from the 4-day week. Not just savings in terms of improved productivity, better work-life balance, and savings of people's lives and time, which are pretty substantial, but also savings in terms of lower carbon expenditure, lower energy usage, which which can benefit all of us either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, that was an interesting experiment. So, well, we'll see what happens. We'll keep an eye on things, but it'll be interesting to see if a whole country can commit to it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing any work with Andrew Barnes, which is for the global?
Yeah, certainly I have appeared. I have shared shared several real or virtual stages with Andrew. We are. He's kind of dividing his time between New Zealand and the UK, so we don't have a lot of opportunity to get together over coffee, even if all this other stuff weren't happening. But certainly no one can can say that Andrew has not been incredibly enthusiastic and really strikingly effective as a champion of the 4-day week. And I think, I know of plenty of companies who credit Andrew with inspiring them to make the jump themselves. So I think if Andrew and Perpetual Guardian did not exist, it would be necessary to invent a company like them as in order to push the story of sort of how the 4-day week can be beneficial.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Alex, I wanted to ask you, and I just spaced it
Mm-hmm.
when you were talking. Deep play.
Yeah.
State of flow. Working fewer hours, but more focused attention seem to be all great, and eliminating distractions as much as possible seem to be all great strategies for somebody to get into being able to work less and get more done. What are your preferred ways of a deep play personally?
I do an awful lot of walking and hiking. The Bay Area is wonderful for that. And I'm fortunate to live pretty close to a couple parks that have some pretty good, some pretty good trails. I also do a pretty fair amount of cycling. And I also watch, not a lot, but a certain amount of, sort of Game of Thrones or other really engaging, sort of engaging shows of that sort. So I think so that's what I do.
Thank you. I see Shorter on the
Mm-hmm.
back, in your back, so we'll link to Shorter. And
Great.
I see Rest. And do you have any plans to write more books? What's on the agenda?
Yeah, right now I am mainly focused on helping companies put the lessons of Rest and Shorter into practice. I'm also spending some time continuing to talk to companies that have implemented 4-day weeks or other kinds of shorter working hours. I'm also looking at this in education. There is, in the homeschooling world, it turns out, a kind of segment of people who talk about how a 4-day week homeschooling is a great thing. A couple medical schools, interestingly, have moved to 4-day teaching schedules. Stanford Med did this last year. University of Miami is going to start this fall, or at least it was going to until everything blew up. And so following out how a shorter work week can play out in education is, I think it's another really significant realm to explore. Really mainly though, and then, as for future books, too early to say. You know, it's, you know, the next book I write is the book that my agent thinks she can sell to a publisher. So it is, you know, it's one of the things when you write more than one book is you burn up all your romantic ideas about about what writing is, and you replace them with incredibly transactional ideas about, you know, and calculations about what you can sell. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you. Yeah, I know what you mean because I'm writing the Unhustle book. I was stuck on chapter 1 for about 6 months and then figured out how to get into a state of flow and finish the first draft in 2 weeks.
Wow, fabulous.
So now I need to
Oh,
go
mazel
back
tov.
and yeah, thank you. Now I need to go back and do some editing. But
Look, you know, as Louis Brandeis said, there is no great writing, there is only great rewriting. The first draft is not meant to be perfect. The first draft is meant to exist. And revision is always easier than just getting the words out on the page the first time. So you're doing it exactly the right way. Don't worry.
you. Thank you. You know, it was interesting. I mean, I realized that I realized that my whole life in the past 2 years really has been moving towards that direction of getting and being able to live and work in flow.
Mhm.
And all the practices that I'm doing, all the mindfulness, all the meditations, all the Unhustle morning practices, all of these things were adding up. And it hit me. I was like, this is exactly why I'm doing them. Now I need to put it into practice. And it's amazing what you can accomplish in such a little time.
Absolutely. Yes. And, you know, I think that, you know, for anybody who hasn't actually read it, the original book about flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is a real revelation, because we often talk about flow mainly as a tool for higher productivity. And it certainly can be that. But Csikszentmihalyi's book does a fantastic job of explaining how it is that flow makes us happier, makes us better people, helps us lead better lives, as well as helping us do the kind of work that we love to do more effectively. So I think that it is, you know, there are not that many books that are almost guaranteed to change your life, but Csikszentmihalyi's Flow is one of them.
Thank you. I'll link to that as well in the show notes. Well, Alex, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. Last piece of advice to people who are overworked, overwhelmed, stressed out, and need to unhustle.
You know, I think take rest seriously, because the world is never going to give it to you, right? So you actually have to carve out time for it and make it yourself. But once you do, you will be amazed at the benefits that will come from it. So take rest and take it seriously.
Thank you. Excellent. And where can people get in touch with you and learn more about you and your books?
Sure. My books, Shorter and Rest, and an earlier book about technology and distraction called The Distraction Addiction, are available, you know, wherever books are sold, as they say. So whether that's your local independent bookseller, or whether it is, you know, the, you know, gigantic e-commerce behemoth, they're available there. I actually read the audiobook for Shorter. So so that's either a pro or a con, depending upon how you feel about the last hour. I am continuing to follow the movement to shorten workdays and write about it on my company website, which is strategy.rest. Rest now being very happily for me a top-level domain. And then finally on Twitter and Instagram, I am Ask Pang, AskPang. One of them is more kind of research related. The other is mainly pictures of my dogs, but you know, with the occasional rest or shorter related thing. So,
love it.
but that's where you can find me.
Excellent. And I'll link to all of this as well in the in the show notes. Thank you so much, Alex. It's been a real pleasure. Enjoy your day, and I look forward to staying in touch with your work.
Thank you very much, Melina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.